I saw Star Trek Nemesis in 2002 and had no idea I was witnessing the birth of a star. When I watched Star Trek Nemesis in 2002, I really had no idea I was witnessing the birth of a star. Tom Hardy. Directed by Stuart Baird from a screenplay by John Logan, Star Trek Nemesis was the final movie starring the cast of Star Trek: The Next Generation. The lowest grossing of Star Trek's 13 theatrical feature films, Star Trek Nemesis was also a bomb with critics and audiences, although the blame for its failure doesn't fall on the shoulders of Tom Hardy, who played the main villain, Shinzen. Shinzen was the malevolent clone of Captain Jean-Luc Picard, Patrick Stewart, in Star Trek Nemesis. Seeking revenge on the Romulans who created and enslaved him, and on the United Federation of Planets, Shinzen mounts a convoluted plot to install himself as the Romulan Praetor before attacking the Federation. But Shinzen has special enmity for Picard and the crew of the USS Enterprise. Ultimately, Captain Picard defeated Shinzen and saved the galaxy, with his clone perishing in the destruction caused by Shinzen's own Theleron weapon. Star Trek Nemesis was Tom Hardy's first major movie role. Tom Hardy had roles in Black Hawk Down and Band of Brothers in 2001 before he was cast as Shinzen, and Star Trek Nemesis was Hardy's big break. When he was cast as Captain Picard's evil clone, Hardy had the benefit of joining the established and popular Star Trek movie franchise and working with Sir Patrick Stewart, John Logan, who wrote Gladiator, Stuart Baird, who directed U.S. Marshals, and Ron Perlman, who played Shinzen's viceroy. Shinzen, the main villain of Star Trek Nemesis, was meant to be a showcase role for Hardy. Unfortunately, Star Trek Nemesis was a disappointment that failed to find a wider audience or appeal to the core Star Trek fanbase. Star Trek Nemesis bombing ended the Star Trek: The Next Generation movie franchise, and there were no more Star Trek movies for 7 years before J.J. Abrams rebooted Star Trek successfully, with Chris Pine leading a new Starship Enterprise cast. However, I'm not surprised Tom Hardy emerged with his career unblemished by Star Trek Nemesis. Watching Star Trek Nemesis, Hardy's star potential wasn't immediately obvious. The great performances to come and recognition that would await Tom Hardy weren't immediately obvious from Star Trek Nemesis. Since Shinzen was Picard's clone, Hardy needed to physically resemble Patrick Stewart's Enterprise captain, which resulted in Shinzen being bald and wearing a prosthetic nose. Shinzen was meant to be as brilliant as Captain Picard and a formidable leader, yet Hardy's clone was ill-defined and lacked the intended menace. To me, Shinzen comes off as petulant and incompetent as the leader of the Remans bent on destroying the Federation. Star Trek Nemesis' subplot where Shinzen psychically violated Counselor Deanna Troi, Marina Sirtis, also did Tom Hardy no favors. In his memoir, Making It So, Patrick Stewart called Tom Hardy odd and solitary on set, but he acknowledged Tom's acting talent. Watching Hardy perform as Shinzen, he doesn't come off as Picard's equal, although Tom does capably hold his own in his scenes with Stewart. But Tom Hardy's volatility, unpredictability, and edge are bubbling underneath the surface, albeit hamstringed by Shinzen needing to be a fractured mirror reflection of Captain Picard. Tom Hardy's career is probably the best thing to come out of Star Trek Nemesis. Tom Hardy rose to greater heights after Star Trek Nemesis in 2002, and he quickly put Shinzen behind him. Certainly, working with director Christopher Nolan elevated Tom Hardy's career to another level. Hardy stole scenes as Eames in Inception before Nolan cast him as Bane, the villain of The Dark Knight Rises. Becoming the burly Bane meant Hardy had the unenviable task of following the late Heath Ledger's Academy Award-winning performance as the Joker in The Dark Knight. But Tom wowed audiences with his powerful Batman villain. Hardy worked with Nolan once more in Dunkirk as his career continued its hot streak. In 2002, I sat in a dark theater, eagerly awaiting the opening of Star Trek Nemesis, the 10th film in the beloved sci-fi franchise. The familiar buzz of anticipation filled the air, as fans, myself included, braced for another thrilling adventure with the crew of the USS Enterprise. Little did I know, amidst the galactic battles, moral dilemmas, and technobabble, I was witnessing the birth of a star, a young actor who, though largely unknown at the time, would go on to become one of the biggest names in Hollywood. His name was Tom Hardy. At the time, Star Trek Nemesis didn't seem like a major cinematic moment. In fact, for many, it was seen as a disappointing end to the Next Generation film series. Despite the film's mixed reception, Hardy's portrayal of the villainous Shinzen, a complex, tortured clone of Captain Jean-Luc Picard, was one of the film's few saving graces. As a die-hard Star Trek fan, I focused on the plot, the philosophical questions about nature versus nurture, and the usual space action. But what escaped me, and probably most other moviegoers, was the sheer magnetism of Hardy's performance. At 25 years old, he was stepping into some very big shoes, acting opposite the legendary Patrick Stewart, and more than holding his own. The character of Shinzen was unlike most Star Trek villains we had seen before. He wasn't just another power-hungry alien bent on destruction. He was a mirror image of Picard, genetically engineered to be his younger double, but raised in the harsh, brutal environment of the Reman slave mines. The role required not only a physical transformation, but also an emotional depth that few actors could pull off convincingly. Hardy managed to imbue Shinzen with a vulnerability that made him more than just a standard Sci-Fi antagonist. He was at once terrifying and tragic, a man who had been shaped by his circumstances into a monstrous version of what he might have been. Watching Nemesis back then, I didn't fully appreciate how much of Hardy's own charisma and intensity were already on display in that role. Part of this was because the movie itself, with its action-heavy plot and sometimes uneven pacing, didn't give his performance the focus it deserved. But even in a film where the story faltered, Hardy's raw talent shone through. I remember being struck by the way he portrayed Shinzen's inner turmoil, his desperate need for validation, and his existential dread of being nothing more than a clone destined for a short, brutal life. Hardy gave Shinzen layers that elevated him above the one-dimensional villains often seen in action films, and yet, at the time, I simply didn't connect the dots. It wasn't until years later, when Hardy exploded onto the scene with films like Inception, 2010, and The Dark Knight Rises, 2012, that I realized I had witnessed the beginning of something special. Hardy's rise to stardom was meteoric after Inception, where his turn as the suave, sharp-witted Eames displayed a new dimension of his talent. A playful charm that contrasted starkly with the brooding intensity he brought to Shinzen. But the performance that really cemented his status as one of the best actors of his generation was in The Dark Knight Rises, where he played the menacing Bane, a role that required not just physical transformation, but also a mastery of subtlety, even when half of his face was obscured by a mask. Reflecting back on Star Trek Nemesis, it's fascinating to think how Tom Hardy's career could have gone in a completely different direction. The film's lukewarm reception certainly didn't propel him to stardom overnight. In fact, Hardy has spoken about how difficult that time was for him personally. After Nemesis, he faced several years of professional and personal struggles, including a battle with addiction. But instead of being defeated by the setbacks, Hardy emerged stronger, more focused, and with a drive to prove himself as an actor. Today, Tom Hardy is known for his chameleon-like ability to disappear into roles. Whether he's playing the feral, almost wordless Max in Mad Max: Fury Road, 2015, or the quiet, introspective Tommy in Warrior, 2011, Hardy brings a commitment and intensity to his roles that few actors can match. His performances are often marked by a simmering, unpredictable energy that keeps audiences on edge. And while Nemesis may not have been the film that put him on the map, it was certainly where I and many others first glimpsed that potential. Looking back now, I realize that seeing Star Trek Nemesis wasn't just a routine trip to the movies for a fan of the franchise. It was a rare moment where I unknowingly witnessed the early career of an actor who would go on to redefine modern Hollywood.